stop everything, because what we are watching right now is not normal, and it is not something that has unfolded this way before. In just the last 24 hours, something genuinely extraordinary has taken place, something that is already sending shockwaves through the corridors of power in Washington. Powerful forces have moved quietly but decisively against a former president who is actively clawing his way back into the political spotlight. And as this story continues to unfold, it is increasingly clear that by the end of it, the situation may look irreversible. This is not speculation. This just happened. Pentagon officials have now distanced themselves as Donald Trump makes demands. The United States military has drawn a line. And tonight we begin unpacking what amounts to a seismic shift. The guardians of America's military power signaling that they are done accommodating a figure who has, for years, tested the outer limits of authority. The Pentagon has taken what can only be described as an extreme and highly unusual action. And the target of that action is Donald J. Trump, the man who has never shied away from pushing the envelope when it comes to military loyalty and national security directives. According to multiple sources, this move was triggered by a refusal to comply with what insiders describe as unprecedented demands coming from Trump's camp. Demands that reportedly included mobilizing military resources for operations viewed internally as politically motivated. The decision was made behind closed doors during an emergency session inside the Pentagon's E-Ring, where top military leadership convened in a late-night meeting that stretched into the early hours of the morning. By this morning, the outlines of that decision began to emerge. Statements leaked out just minutes ago confirming that high-ranking officials are now, both publicly and privately, drawing a firm line against any involvement in Trump's latest maneuvers. This is not a vague memo. It is not an off-the-record whisper. It is a full-throated distancing, with Department of Defense spokespeople issuing carefully worded but unmistakable rebukes. The U.S. military serves the Constitution, not any individual, one official stated flatly, a sentiment that has been building steadily since Trump's post-2024 election rhetoric escalated. Sources close to the Joint Chiefs tell us that Trump's demands centered on deploying military assets for border security enhancements, moves that blurred the line between domestic law enforcement and military intervention. These demands echo controversies from his first term, but they are now amplified in a hyper-polarized 2026 political landscape. This time, the response was swift and coordinated. Generals who once navigated Trump's orbit are now prioritizing institutional integrity over personal allegiance. As this news broke, the White House, under the current president but operating in a political environment where Trump's post-election influence still looms large, scrambled to respond. But the Pentagon's move had already rippled outward. Trump's team fired back on social media, with the former president himself posting a fiery thread on X, calling the decision a betrayal by deep state bureaucrats who hate America. But this line drawing by the military is not isolated. It is part of a broader cascade now pulling in other institutions. This morning's developments sparked whispers in Capitol Hill hallways, where even some long-standing GOP stalwarts paused before rushing to Trump's defense. And that pause matters, because this is not a routine procedure. This is not standard political conflict. Moments like this occur only when confidence in a leader's judgment collapses entirely. Institutional behavior now points to a loss of patience, a shift toward enforcement mode, and perhaps even preparation for more forceful responses if events escalate further. The Pentagon, historically apolitical, does not take public stands like this lightly. The last time we saw anything remotely similar was during the 2020 Lafayette Square incident. But this feels different, more definitive, more like a firewall being erected against future overreach. Insiders describe the atmosphere inside the Pentagon as tense but resolute. There is a shared sense that lines must be held now, before demands turn into orders that could compromise missions around the globe. One anonymous source emphasized that this signal is unprecedented because it comes amid Trump's ongoing legal battles and his repeated promises of retribution should he regain power. From the military's perspective, the writing appears to be on the wall. Trump's demands in this light are not merely policy proposals, they are tests of loyalty, tests that risk dragging the armed forces into partisan quagmires from domestic unrest to international flashpoints. And when we dig deeper, we see the trigger point clearly. That refusal. Reports indicate that Trump's camp initially approached mid-level officers informally, seeking commitments ranging from equipment loans to intelligence sharing under the banner of national emergency preparedness. When those overtures were rebuffed, the demands escalated to direct calls to the Secretary of Defense, who then convened the emergency session. The outcome was a blanket policy reaffirmation, no engagement without clear constitutional authority. This morning's press briefing made that stance official, with the DoD spokesperson emphasizing, "Our allegiance is to the chain of command under the current administration, guided by law." From there, the timeline accelerates. Just hours ago, Trump's allies in Congress began mobilizing, with figures like Senator Name tweeting support. But notably absent were responses from key GOP military veterans who remained silent, and that silence speaks volumes. This breaking event is not just about one refusal, it is the spark that could ignite a larger confrontation between executive ambition and institutional safeguards. Former allies are no longer defending Trump with their usual intensity. Party leaders and insiders who were once vocal are now hedging, recalibrating, and watching closely as the Pentagon's stance reverberates. Silence from figures like General Retired Name and groups such as the Veterans Affairs Committee underscores the shift. Behind the scenes, reactions inside Trump's inner circle are described as panic, distancing maneuvers, damage control, and quiet exits from advisory roles. Public loyalty is being replaced by caution. Statements now emphasize respect for institutions over personal allegiance. Politically, they see what is coming. The signs are unmistakable. Trump's demands, once framed as necessary for America First policies, are increasingly viewed as liabilities, burdens that could tarnish the broader conservative movement. One GOP senator, speaking off the record, put it bluntly, "We can't afford another January 6th-style fallout, especially with midterms looming." This is not overt sabotage. It is a subtle shift, like rats sensing a sinking ship. Insiders report hushed conversations in Mar-a-Lago circles, where even die-hard supporters are quietly discussing contingency plans if the military's line holds firm. And that brings us to the second explosive dimension of this story, a brewing Senate mutiny. Trump, increasingly isolated, faces a quiet rebellion from GOP insiders that threatens to plunge the Capitol into deeper turmoil. Yes, the Pentagon's move has now spilled into the legislative branch. A mutiny is forming among Republican senators who were once Trump's bulwark. Triggered by the same demands that alarmed the military, calls for Senate-backed resolutions to pressure the Department of Defense are meeting resistance. A faction of GOP insiders is no longer just uneasy. They are openly rebelling. This morning, behind closed doors, in a caucus meeting that was never meant for public view, voices like Senator Nas pushed back against the idea of blindly following Donald Trump's lead. The argument was not framed as ideology or personality, but as risk to national security and risk to party unity. And outside that room, the disorder was already visible. The anarchy on Capitol Hill was palpable. Shouts echoed through the chambers as pro-Trump loyalists collided with moderates, a confrontation that ended not in resolution, but in an abrupt adjournment. This is mutiny, one Trump ally shouted. And yet, even as that accusation rang out, the betrayals, at least as Trump's allies see them, were already piling up. Key figures, including some who have directly benefited from Trump's endorsements, are now creating distance. Their statements are careful, almost surgical. Praise for Trump's vision, paired with pointed reminders about the need for checks and balances. Behind the scenes, the tone is far less composed. Private emails leaked to the press reveal something closer to panic. We can't let this drag us down. Time for damage control. What makes this moment different is that it does not end with rhetoric. This action sets in motion enforcement mechanisms that can accelerate quickly. The list of possible outcomes is no longer hypothetical. Contempt proceedings if Trump escalates, potential seizure or freezing of assets connected to his demands, and even arrest warrants if mishandling of classified information is alleged. Removal processes for any officials deemed complicit are now on the table, setting the stage for a constitutional showdown. In this system, one move forces the next, through legal obligations, automatic triggers, and mandatory reporting requirements to oversight committees. That cascade begins with the Pentagon's formal report to Congress, due by the end of the day, laying out the demands it refused. That report alone could trigger hearings under the National Defense Authorization Act, pulling in the Senate Armed Services Committee, precisely where this mutiny is already taking shape. And if Trump responds not directly, but through surrogates issuing executive-style orders, that response activates judicial review, potentially placing the matter before the Supreme Court, even as it struggles under an already crowded docket on executive power. Behind the scenes, lawyers are moving fast. Trump's legal team is preparing emergency filings, framing the Department of Defense's refusal as insubordination. But legal experts are openly skeptical, pointing to recent rulings that reaffirm military autonomy. The power cascade, once started, is difficult to stop. Refusal generates documentation. Documentation generates investigations. Investigations, in turn, have the potential to expose broader networks of influence peddling. What is striking is how coordinated the institutions appear to be. There is speed and there is silence, an efficiency that contrasts sharply with the visible chaos. That coordination suggests a belief that Trump's resistance is weakening, perhaps under the weight of ongoing probes into his finances and associations. This is the containment phase: prevent spillover, isolate Trump's demands from mainstream policy, limit collateral damage, and safeguard alliances. The objective is explicit: control the narrative before Trump's media apparatus recasts this as a deep state coup, close off escape routes like mass public mobilization, and lock in positions so there is no retreat. Sources describe interagency huddles involving the NSA and the FBI, closely monitoring communications from Trump's camp for signs of escalation. The silence is deliberate. There are no leaks beyond what is necessary to signal resolve. Taken together, this points to a unified front. The system appears to be doing what it was designed to do, self-correcting in the face of what it perceives as a threat to stability in an already volatile global environment. As the day continues, the expectation is escalation from Trump himself. Public defiance statements, a possible rally announcement, a Fox News appearance. Emergency filings are already moving through the federal courts, and counterorders from sympathetic governors could soon test the fault lines between state and federal authority. All the while, international reactions are beginning to surface, particularly from allies uneasy about the unpredictability of the United States. The pace is accelerating. Expect a barrage of statements from Trump and his inner circle in the coming hours. He has already signaled a major Truth Social livestream tonight, promising to expose what he calls traitors in uniform and on Capitol Hill. At the same time, emergency filings are flooding the courts. Trump's legal team has now submitted a motion for a temporary restraining order, arguing that the Pentagon's refusal to act is unlawful and that executive privilege extends to post-presidency influence over national security matters. Meanwhile, counterorders are emerging from sympathetic red state governors, issuing state-level emergency declarations that could attempt to bypass federal military command structures for border operations. Abroad, the reaction is sharpening. NATO headquarters in Brussels released a carefully calibrated statement reaffirming confidence in the resilience of American democratic institutions. Privately, however, European allies are expressing alarm about potential instability in U.S. command and control. Chinese state media has seized on the moment, running headlines about an American military rebelling against its own leader. Russian outlets are amplifying the narrative of chaos, portraying U.S. leadership as fractured. Financial markets are responding in kind. Defense stocks dropped 2.3% in after-hours trading as investors weigh the risk of prolonged political paralysis disrupting procurement and readiness. At this point, the struggle has moved beyond politics. It has shifted from rhetoric to enforcement, from loyalty to survival. What began as disagreements over resource allocation has become a direct test of whether civilian leadership can compel institutional obedience when those institutions believe a constitutional threat is at hand. Trump's camp is fully committed to defiance. Surrogates are saturating cable news with accusations of a silent coup carried out by generals and so-called rhino senators. The military, however, remains unmoved. Additional Pentagon briefings this afternoon reiterated that any attempt to bypass the chain of command through unofficial channels will be treated as a security breach. And on Capitol Hill, the disorder is deepening. The Senate mutiny is now splitting along generational and ideological lines. Veteran senators who served during Trump's first term are quietly but openly working with moderate Democrats on a rare bipartisan resolution reaffirming civilian control of the military and adherence to constitutional norms. Pro-Trump hardliners have responded by walking out of committee meetings, pledging to block all unrelated legislation until, as they put it, loyalty is restored. Fistfights nearly broke out in a House anteroom when staffers from opposing camps clashed over access to a shared printer, a moment that became symbolic of a far deeper breakdown in decorum. What appeared trivial on the surface reflected something much more serious underneath. Behind the scenes, the escalation is even more intense. Intelligence community sources report heightened monitoring of communications between Trump associates and certain active duty personnel suspected of having made prior loyalty pledges. At the same time, the FBI has quietly opened preliminary inquiries into whether any classified material was improperly discussed in the context of the refused demands. Meanwhile, Pentagon cyber teams are on high alert for potential disinformation campaigns designed to erode public trust in the military's stance. This phase is defined by narrowing options. Trump can choose to double down, rally supporters, call for protests, or push sympathetic lawmakers to introduce impeachment-style articles against dissenting officials. But each of these moves carries risk, with the potential to alienate even more fence-sitters. The institutions, by contrast, appear locked in. Containment has given way to active isolation. Key military bases have increased force protection postures out of what officials describe as an abundance of caution, a phrase that rarely appears without underlying concern. The global systemic stakes are rising by the hour. Allies are quietly repositioning diplomatic cables, preparing contingency plans should U.S. foreign policy become erratic. Financial analysts warn that prolonged uncertainty could trigger a flight to safety into U.S. treasuries and gold, while energy markets brace for volatility if border security rhetoric escalates into actual troop movements without clear authorization. International institutions are now watching with growing unease. NATO has quietly convened an emergency consultation among defense ministers, not in response to an external threat, but to assess the ripple effects on alliance cohesion if America's military appears divided against itself. At the United Nations, Security Council corridors are buzzing with off-the-record conversations about whether this moment signals deeper fragility in the post-Cold War order the United States has long anchored. Key allies, Britain, France, Japan, and Australia, have all issued restrained public statements, while privately pressing Washington for clarity on command reliability and potential Indo-Pacific contingencies. Credibility damage is already measurable. The U.S. legal system itself is facing scrutiny over whether it can constrain a figure who commands such intense loyalty from millions. Executive authority is now under a microscope. If a former president with massive political capital can be openly defied by career institutions, what precedent does that set for future administrations? Alliances are quietly recalibrating. Some European capitals are accelerating independent defense initiatives, hedging against a scenario in which American reliability wavers. The risks now extend in multiple directions. Diplomatic isolation if partners begin treating U.S. commitments with skepticism, market shock if prolonged uncertainty triggers sell-offs in U.S. equities and the dollar, and security repositioning as adversaries probe for weakness. Iran and North Korea have already issued provocative statements framing the moment as proof of American decline. This is no longer a story about one person. This is a test of the system itself, of whether the constitutional architecture built over centuries can withstand sustained pressure from a charismatic leader who views institutions as either allies or obstacles. The possible outcomes are narrowing to three stark paths. Enforcement, in which the military and Congress hold the line through legal and procedural mechanisms. Collapse, if loyalty fractures irreparably and public support surges behind extra-constitutional action. Or historic confrontation, a full-spectrum clash that could redefine executive power for generations. After this moment, nothing returns to normal. Long-held assumptions that military loyalty follows the person in the Oval Office unquestioningly, that Senate majorities bend to the will of a dominant faction, that rhetoric alone can bend reality, have been shattered. The situation is now irreversible, accelerating, and beyond containment. Every hour brings new pressure points: a leaked memo, a defiant tweet, a courtroom ruling, a market tremor, a phone call from a foreign leader. What began as Trump making demands has become a defining stress test for American democracy in the 21st century. The line has been drawn. The institutions have chosen their side. The question that remains is whether the public and history will ratify that choice, or whether the forces of disruption will prove strong enough to redraw the map entirely.